The X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell is largely an opinion talk show. All opinions, comments, or statements of fact expressed by Rob McConnell's guests are strictly their own and are not to be construed as those of the X-Zone Radio Show or endorsed in any manner by Rob McConnell, Relmar McConnell Media Company, the X-Zone Broadcast Network, its affiliated networks, stations, employees, or advertisers.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome to the X-Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell, and I have to start off this segment by saying happy birthday, Canada. Canada is now officially 141 years old. Actually, no, let me rephrase that. 141 years young. And I'll tell you, it's great to be a Canadian.
Canada is the Rocky Mountains. Canada is Prince Edward Island. Canada is a country made for love. Canada is la belle Provence. Canada is the Yukon Minor. Canada is a country loving peace. We have peace.
And I'd like to welcome all our affiliates now to this hour, the hour that turns Canada, my home country, 141 years young. So no matter where you are, whether you're a Canadian that is stationed across in the Middle East, maybe you're a pilot flying somewhere, maybe you're on a ship in the middle of the Caribbean, and you're celebrating the birthday of Canada right now, right this very minute. To Canada, from everyone in the X-Zone Nation, happy birthday, Canada. 1-877-528-8255 is toll-free throughout the U.S., Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii. And my name is Rob McConnell, and this is the X-Zone Radio Show on the Talkstar Radio Network, live from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. On this hour, I'm going to be joined shortly by Dr. Nick Begich. We're going to be talking about everything from controlling the human mind to Angels Don't Play This HAARP, and much more. On this day, by the way, Dan Aykroyd is celebrating his 56th birthday. And it was on this day in 1929, I mean, besides being Canada's birthday, the cartoon character Popeye was born. And spinach growers everywhere were rejoiced. And also on this date in 1963, the U.S. Postal Service introduced the zip code. Oh my gosh, where did July come from? Well, add up today's date. 07 plus 1 equals 8. Interesting, huh? I still can't figure out why my staff gave me that one. Makes no sense. Let me see. Liv Tyler turns 31 today. And also today, this is, by the way, July the 1st, begins Hot Dog Month. Did you realize that the number of hot dogs Americans eat every year is 20 billion? The number of hot dogs that an average American eats every year is equal to, is 70. An American eats 70 hot dogs a year. And if you took those hot dogs and laid them end to end, the number of times they would circle the Earth at the equator is 27. The year that Frankfurt, Germany claims the Frankfurt was invented is 1487. So there you go, some hot dog facts. When I come back from this 2-minute commercial break, Dr. Nick Begich joins me here in the X-Zone. And once again, to Canada, a very happy birthday from everyone here at the X-Zone and the X-Zone Nation.
Take a step back in time and discover old Florida cuisine at Marsh Landing Restaurant in Fellsmere. Enjoy delicacies such as frog legs, gator tail, catfish, and swamp cabbage, or enjoy the more traditional cuisine like hand-cut Angus steaks, ribs, and seafood. Join us for breakfast with a southern flair featuring sweet potato pancakes, biscuits, and gravy, and much more. Planning a party? Marsh Landing's private dining room can accommodate groups from 8 to 80 people. While you're visiting, enjoy the historic pictures, artifacts, and stories that line the walls. Marsh Landing is truly a unique experience. Marsh Landing Restaurant, 44 North Broadway in historic Fellsmere, or visit marshlandingrestaurant.com. Marsh Landing, Old Florida cuisine at its best. Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone broadcast network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Are you interested in the paranormal, ghosts, UFOs, or psychic phenomenon? Join me, Tim Bartley, co-host of Talking to Spirits with Lightworkers Tim and Justina, coming mid-January 2017 to the XZBN. We will channel spirits live and talk to them, revealing all kinds of amazing information. Spiritual attachments will be found and removed on the show, and so much more. To find out when you can listen to Talking to Spirits with Lightworkers Tim and Justina, visit www.xzbn.net for listeners on both sides of the veil.
Now, there's a great Canadian band, April Wine, and Laura and I were fortunate enough to watch them last night at Hamilton's Festival of Friends. They were the grand finale act, and what a great show that was. We were also fortunate enough to see another group that's well known in Canada called the Spoons. It was a great day, and to all the organizers of the Festival of Friends here in Hamilton, Ontario, job well done. 1-877-528-8255, toll free throughout the U.S., Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii. My name is Rob McConnell. My guest this hour is Dr. Nick Begich. And Nick, welcome back to the X-Zone. How are you, and how are things up in Alaska?
Well, it's great. Actually, we're having a really nice day just north of Anchorage today. We've had a little bad weather and a really cold summer here after being spoiled the last few years. So that's kind of the bad news, but it's bright and sunny even as we're speaking right now.
Nick, I was watching a special on Discovery Channel the other day, and they were talking about the increase in popular belief that the masses are under extensive mind control.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that on a lot of different levels. And the most prevalent, and I guess the simplest thing, is just the general use of fear, which, of course, we see quite a bit these days, whether it's terrorism, our Social Security checks, or our retirements, our home mortgages. I mean, if you look across the spectrum, just that level of fear alone causes actually the brain to fall into patterns that won't allow you to reach higher states of consciousness, those kinds of states that lend themselves to good decision-making, as well as our most creative problem-solving sort of capacities of the brain. So fear, pretty much predominates as sort of a basic method, but much more sophisticated methods have also been developed over the years.
Such as?
Well, when you go back historically, and what we did is we sort of looked at the history of this, going back to hypnosis, starting at Harvard University back in the 1920s. They had a guy named Estabrooks that was heavily involved in the idea of creating a super spy. And his idea was that you could take someone down. In fact, he did this on many occasions, according to his own words and own work later in life. But what he did is he took people into a very deep state of hypnosis, and then over 9 to 10 months could program into that individual sort of a second personality or a split personality, where one would have full knowledge of one, sort of the existence of the other, and the other would have no knowledge. So you could send this new personality into, say, a foreign country. They could act as a spy, and if they got captured, they wouldn't be able to tell you anything. And he actually developed this series of techniques. They were classified by the mid-30s, but he went on and published a lot of things in this area. Started to begin to sort of resurface. You didn't hear much about it until around the Korean War, and then after the Korean War, many will remember returning prisoners of war that were exhibiting very bizarre behavior, handing out communist leaflets on street corners and so on, and the phrase brainwashing was sort of coined. And that's when our government became even more aggressively involved in the research, started looking at ways to manipulate the brain, and the CIA and military intelligence groups began to work in this area. In fact, CIA had 149 sub-projects under one general program called MK Ultra, where they were using chemical means as well as other means for manipulating human behavior.
In fact,
and that's sort of the beginning of the big sort of notorious side of it all.
In fact, some of the experiments under MK Ultra occurred at McGill University's Royal Victoria Hospital.
That's
or the
correct.
Allen Memorial.
That's
under
correct.
you and Cameron,
Yeah, and Cameron actually, as sort of a surrogate for the CIA in Canada, doing that work. I think Canadians were some of the only victims that ever got settled with, actually got some form of compensation. Here in the United States, there was one case that got compensated, and it was a CIA employee that was, I guess, dropped out of a building in New York, is the way the story goes. But in any case, the idea was the CIA thought they could create a lot of potentials, and they were looking at two sort of sides of the equation. They were looking at enhancing human potentials, as well as, what could you learn about how to degrade a human being, by manipulating the brain or behavior itself. And this, this subject, as it continues to gain a lot of currency in this century, even the Air Force has a open RFP, a request for proposal, that doesn't close until September 2009 in this subject area, looking for better ways to interfere with human behavior, utilizing electromagnetic fields as an example. Mm-hmm. The Navy just revised their human experiment protocols, and in 2006, November that year, issued new ones, where the Undersecretary of the Navy, in their work in mind control areas, has to approve that, the Undersecretary, and that's actually right in their own regulation. So the work goes on, and the idea was, again, enhancing human performance or degrading it, or ultimately controlling the human operator.
Nick, if these techniques are available, why would the CIA have to resort to waterboarding to get confessions out of prisoners?
Well, I think there's probably a lot more than that going on. And I don't think we've heard the very beginnings of that. And we may not hear the rest of the story until the Republicans are out of office and the Democrats are in charge. And if they're not in charge at the end of this election cycle, we may never know. But I would suggest that in all of these instances, much more than waterboarding was used. And when you look at the history of what has been developed in the past, I would expect that they would certainly use it. They'll go back to the Vietnam War, even, where we captured a device called the LIDA machine. It was spelled L-I-D-A, and it was a Russian device that was used for putting prisoners of war in trance-like states so the North Vietnamese could interrogate them more readily. And it was just using things like flickering light that would create an entrainment where the optic nerve sort of transfers that energy in, and that pulse rate of the light causes the brain to entrain in a very specific way that puts you into a much more relaxed kind of state, sort of a semi-trance-like state. And these kinds of psychic driving are relatively easily achieved by either flickering light, certain arrangements of sound can create these effects, as well as a pulsed microwave. Almost any pulsed signal, if oscillated in just the right way, can couple with the human body, couple with the mind in such a way as to cause significant chemical changes and thereby behavioral changes within the human body. And so you can use any number of carriers. In fact, there was a great article that was published in the U.S. Army College Quarterly back in 1998, and it was called "The Mind Has No Firewalls," and it described all the different ways you could carry a signal in using radio, TV, internet, even the power grid that surrounds us all the time, by just being able to know enough to oscillate a signal that could change behaviors over a large segment of the population, of those in contact with those kinds of signals.
I was reading an article where Exxon has actually devised a system that would use the Earth's electromagnetic field as a carrier for communications.
Right, and in fact, there was work done in this area long ago. You can go back to Tesla's ideas in this area. That was his whole idea, was to use the magnetic fields and the natural oscillations of planets, not just transfer communications, but also energy and everything else. And it was thought to be something you could do without any appreciable, what we would call line loss or loss in the transmission itself of the energy. In fact, it might even gain energy if you understood it enough, where you could sort of capitalize on what was already here naturally. It wasn't energy out of nowhere. It was just recognizing sort of how to plug into the system that already exists.
Let's go to our phones. We have Nola Lee from Wyoming who is joining us now. Hi, Nola Lee. How are you tonight?
Hi. Thanks for having him on.
Oh, it's my great pleasure.
Okay. First question, how many countries now have this technology?
In terms of influencing human behavior, I think all of the sophisticated governments do by now.
HAARP.
I mean, it's in psychology classes even they explain frequency following responses, the kinds of things I'm describing now. So it's pretty common knowledge. I would expect every sophisticated government, and then even some not so sophisticated, would have access to that.
I believe Nola Lee was talking about HAARP, Nick.
HAARP is probably, you have to look at the European Union through the EasyCat system, Canada, United States, Russia, China as well now has such systems, and there's probably others, because they're essentially phased arrays that they're able to manipulate these antenna arrays in a unique fashion to manipulate sort of natural energy, or being able to manipulate the ionosphere in other cases, or the magnetic field lines that surround the Earth is another case, depending on how they utilize the HAARP array or arrays like HAARP.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for calling, Nola Lee. Take care of yourself and have a happy 4th of July. 1-877-528-8255 is toll-free throughout the U.S., Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii. Dr. Nick Begich is our special guest. And Nick, when it comes to this new technology that Exxon is tapping into, where do you see this when we're looking at the ways in which the human mind can be manipulated or controlled?
Well, I would like to see a lot more information on it. The Earth has a natural oscillation. This is kind of interesting. Schumann's resonance, which is about 7.83 hertz or pulses per second, is the natural oscillation of the Earth, recognized by Schumann back in the early 1950s in Munich. And what we also know is that's the ideal sort of state. It's the lower end of the alpha range, what we would call in terms of our consciousness, sort of when we're in the zone or in that place where just everything sort of clicks right in where you want it. And that's the natural oscillation of the planet. So when you think about amplifying that, that's probably not a bad idea. But when you look at what we are doing, we surround ourselves with not that, but in this country, 60 cycles or 60 hertz, which is an agitating frequency, and that's our power grid. So we start with that, and then we start layering that with lots of other forms of electromagnetic radiation that interact with one another and then create all kinds of complexities in those signals. In fact, I would suggest that that's probably leading to a lot of what we're seeing in terms of human health issues, as well as maybe what we're seeing in some of these other anomalous phenomena as we increase that sort of spectrum that we live in.
Dr. Nick, please stand by. You and I have to take a commercial break. We'll be back after the news. Our special guest this hour, Exo Nation, is Dr. Nick Begich. 2 websites, www.earthpulse.com and www.layinstitute.org. Dr. Nick will be taking your calls at 1-877-528-8255 as the X Zone continues from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Happy birthday, Canada.
This is the X Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
Did you know that when you're on the road with limited data or Wi-Fi, you can still listen to the X-Zone Radio Show with Rob McConnell, The Science of Magic with Gwilda Wiyaka, X-1, Dimension X, Space Patrol, and every minute of the X-Zone Broadcast Network by calling 213-401-0080, courtesy of Audio Now. No smartphone, app, or internet needed. It saves your data plan and it's free if you have unlimited minutes. Call 213-401-0080 to listen on any phone, anytime, anywhere. Remember 213-401-0080 for the best of the paranormal, parapsychology, and sci-fi radio programming anywhere, 24/7, 365.
Welcome back to the X-Zone, everyone, and this portion of the X-Zone is being brought to you by Amira, soul mystic, master clairvoyant healer, and spiritual teacher. And if you'd like more information on Amira, or maybe you would like to find out about the sacred travel trip to Egypt that she is organizing for this November, her toll-free number is 1-800-659-6796. That's 1-800-659-6796. Or you can visit Amira online at www.soulmystic.com. My guest this hour is Dr. Nick Begich. We're talking about mind control. We've talked about MK Ultra. And Nick, what is the truth behind the movie The Manchurian Candidate?
Well, actually, this is what Estabrook was getting at, which was this earlier investigator. And I think he just didn't know there was such a film. It didn't exist when he was doing the work until much later. But it parallels exactly. In fact, there was a couple of organizations that ran a lot of parallel programs. The CIA utilized universities. They utilized, university research programs, as well as independent organizations that were set up essentially to look at what mavericks were doing in various areas of science. And the areas which really overlap was their investigations into the paranormal at the same time. In fact, we have hundreds of pages that were released by the Defense Intelligence Agency, posted on our website, that deal with the Eastern Bloc work in this area. And I think when you look at the mind control issues, there were really two sides to the coin, and everyone always focuses sort of on the Manchurian Candidate component, which was certainly there and shows up well in the literature. Mm-hmm. But the other side was, sort of what else could you do? And I think what they found, and in fact many would bear me out on this, was they found these greater potentials that humans had. And I think that's what really, if you want to talk about frightening the military, I mean, think of things like telepathy as a security risk. I mean, consider that in the hyperactive environment that we're living in today. And the one thing that mitigates it, that stops it right off the bat, that potential, is to elevate the fear levels, where then those, higher sensitivities don't kick in. But actually, on some level, they probably do. There was some work done by researchers in the mid-'80s where they were able to demonstrate in the lab the effectiveness of telepathy as really just the discovery of sort of the transmission system. And what they were able to do in the lab was send a signal from one room to another with 9 test subjects with no experience in this area at all. We're able to interpret, the psychic cards where they have the triangles and the squares and the squiggly lines.
The center cards.
Right, with 100% accuracy. And the work was done by Elizabeth Rauscher and Bill Bice back in 1985. And these are folks that, Bill has passed away a couple years ago. Elizabeth is still alive and a good friend. And this work they demonstrated within a laboratory environment. And I have a copy of the paper. Was never published in scientific quarters, but Elizabeth, she worked at Berkeley as a professor in consciousness studies. She has a Ph.D. in physics, astrophysics, and biophysics. Brilliant person. And there were several people in this area, and the one thing that comes out of all of them was this was the side that the military became more concerned with, this sort of this hyper side of our brain, the part that we don't always plug into except in very rare occasions. At least that's how we how we believe and consequently how it sort of happens.
Where does remote viewing fit into this formula?
Well, I think all of that, the CIA spent, by their own admission at one point, I think it was $23 million in those programs, and it was the same idea of saying, well, wouldn't that be the ultimate, again, looking at ways to spy, ways to interfere. Telekinesis, the same thing, the idea of moving things, in other words, being able to transfer maybe across boundaries and through security systems in a way that would otherwise be not perceptible. And that's where a lot of this science was going, in terms of the research. Where it ended up, a lot of it, was scrapped, but other things became, compelling and ongoing. I mean, you've got now the Electromagnetic Directorate of the Air Force. They published an article called Controlled Effects in June 2004 in Technology Horizons, which is an Air Force publication. The cover story was Controlled Effects, the idea of duplicating sight, taste, smell, touch, all the 5 basic senses, so you would have complete artificial memory sets, if you will. I mean, can you imagine being able to create that kind of change in an individual or a population and what you might be able to do with that? And that's where this is going.
What about the theory, Nick, that that thought and matter, thought and energy could actually be transmitted by the DNA and received by DNA?
Yeah, I can see that. In fact, the book I wrote, Controlling the Human Mind, has a section that really explains sort of the underlying mechanisms, the biological mechanisms, that explain, if you have basic biology or basic electronics, you'll get it, and it's about sort of how that works. And what we did, it took me 28 years to actually get it down to something that I felt comfortable enough an average person could read it, including me, okay, and say, okay, I understand what this means. And the controlling the human mind, the idea of manipulating it for nefarious purposes, has certainly always been out there. But the most exciting, and perhaps the biggest theft of the government in this area is what they learned about enhancing our capacities as human beings. Because, when you think about the basic law, the idea in physics where the observer actually manipulates what you observe, in terms of the quantum physics of how things are constructed. Is it a particle or is it a wave? We're sort of interceding in that. And that tells us a lot about our creative capacity as human beings. The other thing is the amount of computing power that we actually have, and most of us fail to recognize, is we are literally, each of us, a quantum computer. And by way of analogy, a supercomputer today, the fastest computer in the world, you take 3 of them and string them together, and you can get only 1 neuron firing mapped of the brain, of a human brain. 1 neuron firing chain, as it fires through, you can map in 3 dimensions with 3 supercomputers. One of those, in 1 second, does what 6.6 billion people with hand calculators, making a calculation for 60 hours every 5 seconds, what it would take, that computer does in 1 second. A quantum computer, now think about this. Think about those 6.6 billion people working those computers, and picture them doing it for 1 trillion years.
Oh my God.
And a quantum computer can do it in 1 hour, and that's what you and I are. And that's, when you start to think about that possibility, then things change in terms of how we see the world. And I think that's where sort of our belief systems and how it interacts with matter and how that interacts with energy on a very fundamental level is becoming maybe better understood, or at least being attempted to be understood, and then put into play. And mind control ultimately, I think, leads to that.
What should be done to protect us against negative use of mind control, Nick?
Well, I think this is the biggest challenge. In fact, The Economist in 2002 had a cover story on the ethics of mind control. It was, and that was what it said. The cover of The Economist, mind control. And what they were saying is the same thing, is we really need to recognize that governments are dabbling in this area. We were able to take enough evidence into the European Parliament back in the 90s. We testified in a hearing in 1998 on HAARP and on non-lethal weapons, which included these. And we demonstrated a couple of things. And the European Parliament actually passed a resolution. It was their resolution A40005/99, and it says, in Section 27, it called for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings. And it's a political sort of statement in that quote. And this was part of the biggest security and disarmament resolution they have ever passed in their history. And I think governments are starting to take the issue on, and after this there were some studies done. A lot of our work and others' work was quoted there, and what they are essentially starting to do is try to maneuver that into that area where you might actually have some treaty dialogue. And eventually that's where this goes, because when you think about manipulating the human mind, I mean, think about basic freedoms, at least in the United States, that we sort of take for granted, is this idea of assembly and speech and freedom of religion, and all those are sort of presupposed freedom of thought. I mean, this is the 1984 we never wanted to see happening, so it's a little late. It's the same concept, and only it's on a much more technically evolved backdrop. There was another researcher in Canada at Laurentian University. I'm trying to remember his name. He did a lot of work with
Michael Persinger.
Yeah, and did a lot of work with magnetic fields.
Yeah.
He did a little bit of work for the CIA in this area. In 1995, he published a paper that said essentially if you could ever create a signal that you could broadcast broadly enough, oscillate over a large enough area, you could manipulate behavior of large segments of the population, which sort of echoed things that were said by J.F. Gordon MacDonald at UCLA back in the 60s. And when you look at HAARP and what we did with that whole area, you see the biggest ionospheric oscillator ever envisioned that can do exactly that, either as a deliberate effect or a side effect. And we're not talking about transferring like specific thoughts, but general emotional states where you go from perhaps lethargic as a general trend in a population to highly agitated or even riotous.
In 1997, I was part of a BBC special called Contact, and Michael Persinger was one of the guests that we had on the show. And in that show, he actually demonstrated how he could, he had a football cap that was fitted with electrodes.
Right.
And he could actually direct the information of smell into the person who was wearing that football helmet.
Right. He was using, I think, more like solenoids, but nonetheless, it was exactly that, by being able to trigger certain parts of the brain to create certain effects. And through trial and error, he figured out quite a bit, and it's quite brilliant. And I have to say, and there are several researchers in this area, and each of them kind of taking a different tact on it from the direction in which they approach their research. But the cumulative effect of that knowledge is a greater understanding of the modeling of the brain, which then is therein lies the temptation to do it better for you. And even you go back historically, and people get into this. There was actually a guy, Delgado, which many have read about, but his book was Physical Control of the Mind, that everybody references, and the subtitle was Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, something people usually don't think too much about. And he was a guy in the 60s that later figured out how to do this with radio frequency energy in the 80s, where he was using 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces in terms of volume or density of energy, which is, I mean, we as human beings produce 200 million times more than the Earth produces. So this is just like a little grain of sand on the beach, if you want to look at it from that perspective. And that was enough to trigger someone from a passive state to an aggressive state, on and off like a light switch, by just having the right oscillations that the body and mind can identify with. Just like a radio receiver ignores all the signals except those germane to it as you switch through the dials until you get that station in resonance with the transmitter and receiver.
I often wonder if there's any sort of subliminal messages that are being put into these video games that the kids are playing these days.
Well, you can do it in a lot of ways, and you don't have to do it so overtly. Like in the old days, they would flash words, although that can be very effective. The Russians call it the 25th frame effect. In fact, it could be easily spread through computers, through viruses and such, that kind of thing. But the other thing you can do is just by oscillating the field, you can create a certain sort of trance-like relaxed state, or you can do it with a television commercial. Within the first 20, 30 seconds, people can be put into almost a semi-trance state. If you ever watch people come home from work exhausted, which was sort of the first rule, get tired and exhausted, relax to begin with. You kick down really fast, and then the overt words, just the ad itself, anchors extraordinarily effectively. And when most people ride the fence on most issues, that's all it takes to kick you over the top. And so it's perfectly legal. There's no restriction on it, none that I've ever seen in any legislation. Although subliminals would be restricted, the oscillation itself, nope, no legislation. It's like the Internet. When it wasn't regulated, and still in a lot of parts of the world is just beginning to be regulated. You can harass somebody by mail or by telephone, but not by the Internet because there was no code. Same is true here.
Dr. Nick, please stand by. Dr. Nick Begich is our special guest. www.earthpulse.com and www.layinstitute.org. In the next hour, Ellie Marzulli joins us as the X Zone continues live and around the world from our studios in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. My name's Rob McConnell. We'll be back right after this break. Don't go anywhere.
This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
19 Sergeant Central. 19 Sergeant, check. Officers on the scene.
Hi, I'm Larry Lawson, host of Paranormal Stakeout. With over 36 years in law enforcement, I have learned a few things. The most important is the proper gathering and preservation of evidence is vital to putting the bad guy behind bars. It's no different in the world of paranormal investigation. Whether it's the search for the afterlife, cryptozoology, UFOs, and extraterrestrials, how we gather the evidence, preserve that evidence, and present it to a jury of our peers will make the ultimate difference in proving the existence of worlds and entities that are beyond our imagination. Join me, Larry Lawson, every week on Paranormal Stakeout when, along with my guests, we'll take a journey to prove with indisputable evidence what man has struggled to believe for centuries. Go to xzbn.net for the broadcast schedule and check me out at paranormalstakeout.com.
True healing must address 4 levels: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, for us to live joyful and productive lives. We tend to treat 3 of the 4, leaving the spiritual languishing. If you're tired of the same dysfunctional patterns cropping up in your life, Soul Balancing is for you. Trixie Phelps, owner and founder of Soul Balancing, is a naturally gifted energy healer trained in numerous esoteric forms, including shamanism. Trixie has created a powerful modality that safely and effectively clears your energetic field. A soul balancing session can remove interference, heal trauma, and restore your hope. Contact Trixie for a life-changing long-distance session today, www.soulbalancing.world.
Welcome back to the X-Zone on the Talkstar Radio Network. 1-877-528-8255 is toll-free. Our special guest this hour, Dr. Nick Begich, and his websites are www.earthpulse.com and www.layinstitute.org. Nick, what about implant technology, new surveillance technologies, and how are these going to figure into the mind control issue?
Well, the idea of requiring an implant is not even necessary, at this point. I think that's a whole different issue. It's really about tracking populations generally, and everyone who has a cell phone is already sort of participating in the program, whether they know it or not. Of course, when it was sold to the public, it was in place of sort of 911. When you call from a hard line or a landline, they can figure out where you are, and so they required that in most of the new cell phones, so they're manufactured with GPS built in. And GPS is thought to be a convenience, and so people generally accepted it. You'll start to see The microcircuits, of course, have reduced in size and increased in power, and that's the big thing because you can store more information in a smaller and smaller space. Where this is going to play in is imagine every single thing in your home, for instance, having a unique tag. Now, it's not like a barcode, which just kind of tells you, hey, this is a book and this is how much it costs. This is something more than that. It says this is a book, this is how much it costs, and this is book number 1,632, you know. So it's very specific.
So are we talking about RFIDs here?
Yes. And so when you walk into, say a home in the future, what you'll be able to do is your IRS authorities could go in and say, well, this is your complete inventory, you know, with the wave of a wand, if you will. And when you start to think about tracking individuals, you know, through your purchases where your RFIDs are literally tagged to your credit card, to your check, to generally very little is done in cash anymore. Yeah. As a consequence, then that becomes sort of a tag to you that's unique, but it's not necessarily under your skin. So I think we're already seeing some of that. There were some new technologies for readers that will allow you to read RFIDs up to a kilometer away, which sort of kills the security idea. The other place is they're planning to put these in currencies for tracking currency. So then when you go to the bank and get your money and you go spend it at business A, throughout the economy, as things move from place to place, the money is traceable. And this will be, of course, for security and because it's gotten so cheap, but again, it tracks uniquely to you because it always comes back to, you know, it's individuals that transact goods and money and services, whether you have a tag in your toe or not.
Nick, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Always a great pleasure. Please come back soon and share with us some more of the great concepts that you have. And thanks very much for being there for us.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. Anytime you want me back, just give me a holler. We'll get it scheduled.
You got a deal. Thanks very much, Nick. Take care of yourself, and happy 4th of July. 1-877-528-8255 is toll-free throughout the U.S., Canada, Alaska, and Hawaii. When I come back from the news at the top of the hour, Ellie Marzulli will be joining me for politics, prophecy, and the paranormal as the X Zone continues live and around the world right here on the Talkstar Radio Network. Happy birthday, Canada.